Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on Every Man in This Village is a Liar. My name is Mrs. Tedesco and today I'm going to be talking to you particularly about the prologue of the story. To understand the prologue, I'm giving you a little bit of context first, and then I'm going to read the prologue, making notes as I go. Feel free to have your copy of the novel or the chapter with you so that you can also highlight and make notes on the side of the text, and feel free to add to those notes as we go. So the context of the prologue is that it is set in the Bronx, New York, USA. So it's also important to be aware that the prologue is written from Megan's memories as a child, and her first experiences of war. So Megan Stack, the author's uncle, was sent to Beirut in Lebanon as a soldier, and he returned a very changed person, and he ended up committing suicide as a consequence of the post-traumatic stress that he suffered. If you wanted to learn a little bit more about that particular conflict, it's quite an interesting one. I'm pretty sure that it is the peacekeeping mission in 1982. So if you want to look that up, go for it. But you can still have a really good understanding of the things that Megan experienced or learned about war from this distance, this second-hand experience of seeing how it affected her uncle. So I'm just going to make a note that it is a second-hand experience of war that she is narrating for us. So something else to be aware of is that there are two core ideas that she covers. The first one is that the idea that war can bring peace is a lie. So she is arguing against the idea that any type of violence, in particular a war, could help solve a problem. And in fact, she says it creates more problems. But she also looks at the post-traumatic stress disorder that those involved in war suffer from. And she gives us this statement here. The first lesson that she learned is that you can survive and not survive both at the same time. So even though physically her uncle survived the war, he did not survive in the same way that he existed before the war. He was a very different person. The Johnny that left was not the same Johnny that returned. So I'm going to give you a little bit of geographical context to the story. So Megan Stack, as a child, grew up in New York, and her uncle fought in Lebanon, which is right here. And so for Megan, it was another world away. It was like a completely different universe to her. She didn't know anything about Lebanon. It just had this sort of mystical sense of fear because of the adults around her and what they said. And so it was like another world, and she actually mentions a quote at the very start, which you guys don't get to see unless you have the copy of the novel, where she says, she quotes Arthur Miller, that there is nothing farther away from Washington than the entire world. And what she means by that is that this area here, everywhere outside of the United States, is like a different universe. It's a different existence that they struggle to understand, and that they're so focused on their own lives in America that they don't even realize or care or understand how other places can think and feel differently to them. So just to zoom in a little bit, Lebanon is right on the edge. It borders with Israel, which is important because we're going to have our another analysis of chapter 4, which is set in Israel. There are other chapters within the text which focus specifically on Lebanon, but for now all we really need to know is that this is where Johnny was fighting. Okay, so let's begin. Prologue. This memory from childhood is still there. The voices of the adults bounce fretfully, eternally, in rooms that have since been sold or abandoned. So she is writing about her childhood It's a long time ago. Beirut, they said, never Lebanon. John was in Beirut. All meaning fit into those words. So what she's saying is that just saying that John was in Beirut had this symbolic sense of fear that it created for the family. His barracks had blown up, but he had survived. John, the drinker, the smoker, apprentice in three-card Monte and hanger-out with New York street cons, his face cut by light, arms angled in salt air. His imprint lingers still in corners and amber edges. John was my father's cousin, my godfather's brother. Our two Irish Catholic families braided together in city blocks. So we get a sense of her views and values by her religious background that she's provided for us. And we get the sense that these two families are very, very close. So the families are braided together in city blocks in the Bronx by marriage and crosshatches of godfathering. He was adrift between the generations of our family, too old to be a cousin and too young to be an uncle, but still unmistakably one of us. With us in churches and cramped living rooms and summers on the beach. In my earliest memories, I waddle in his retreating shadow, arms in the air and begging, "Johnny, uppy." And then this skinny street hustler sweeps me into the air to swing on the rim of centrifugal force until the salty, sunny world swims. So what she's doing here is she's providing us with that sort of childhood nostalgia of what it was like when they were innocent, and she was just a child. Even then, John had endured the things I feared most. His mother had died. He was feeling very badly, my mother said, and so again we have that the phrasing is very badly. It's giving that sense of her as a child, trying to show the innocence of childhood. You shouldn't ask him about it. John got into a little trouble, and then into some more trouble, so they sent him to live with my grandparents to get him out of New York. And when that didn't work, they signed the papers allowing him to enlist. He was only 16. The Marines sent him to Beirut. So this here suggests that this is something that Johnny wanted to do. Johnny wanted to join the army, even though he wasn't of age and he needed their permission. It gives the sense that he'd been nagging at them to do this. And the Marines sent him to Beirut. It sort of feels like, how could they do that to him when he was so young? Hezbollah bombed the bunkers. Thank God he's all right, the adult said. Nobody talked about Hezbollah then, not in our house. Hezbollah didn't mean anything. It was a featureless enemy in a war that was real only insofar as it touched our household. So Hezbollah is the radical terrorist group that is based in Lebanon. And so they had been bombed by Hezbollah, and he survived that bombing. The description of Hezbollah was as a featureless enemy, so an inhuman enemy, evil. And they only really talked about it because Johnny was fighting them. If Johnny hadn't have been over there, they wouldn't have mentioned this part of the world at all, or this enemy. A bomb explodes and everything goes wrong. John lived, but he wasn't all right. 305 people died around him. A few years later, he shot himself in the head. It was just before Thanksgiving. He was a father. He was young. We drove to New York for the funeral. They printed prayer cards and sewed his head back together for the open coffin. People stood around and whispered. It didn't look as bad as you might think, but it didn't look good either. And so all of that previous nostalgia and innocence of childhood is suddenly confronted by the language that she's using here. A bomb explodes, shot himself in the head, people died. And it's contrasting, it's juxtaposed against that earlier description of her childhood experiences on the beach with her Uncle Johnny. For a long time, that was everything I knew. Not just about Beirut, but about war. That it was dark and dangerous, and that you can survive and not survive, both at the same time. I was 25 when I covered the war in Afghanistan. I wound up there by accident, rushed in foreign correspondence by coincidence, because I was vacationing in Paris on September 11. Okay, so hopefully you have by now found out a little bit about September 11, and this is what led Megan Stack to become a war correspondent. The fact that she was having a holiday in France, which is quite near. If we go back and see, here's France, and here's the Middle East. So it's much closer to the Middle East than anyone in America. It's quite close in terms of being able to get there quickly to report on what was happening. So it wasn't something that she chose to do. It was something that she fell into, being a war correspondent. Before that, I was a national correspondent in Houston. So I was a reporter who didn't really know how to write about combat, covering America from outside its borders as it crashed zealously into war and occupation. I love that word there, zealously. It's like excitedly, with a huge energy, and without thinking. So she's saying that America is just diving into this without thought. This huge change came without warning, but it felt wholly natural. It would be my generation's fate, it seemed, to be altered by September 11. So I would write about war. Soldiers would fight, and Americans would rearrange the way they thought about things. And so what she is saying is that Americans prior to September 11 felt very safe. They felt secure, and they felt masters of their own environment. They felt like they could control everything that happened in America, and that they were sort of the peacekeepers of the world. And so September 11 forced them to reconsider that view of themselves, and become much more aware of the world outside of their own bubble. Everything was negotiable. You couldn't imagine what would happen next. So what she's saying there is that there's no set rule about how they would go about this new conflict that America was diving into. I got excited and felt that I was living through important times, and went rushing in. So again, we have this sense that she has joined in a very naive way, without any awareness of the impact of what she's joining, what she's going to be experiencing. And it sort of foreshadows some of the things that we see throughout. She came away different, with damage that couldn't be anticipated beforehand and can't be counted after. That is the way it goes, the way people get older and empires begin to slip. And now the fear is that it didn't mean anything. Isn't that what we all suspect about the war on terror? The long war, the war that hasn't ended? So here we have that repetition. And she is repeating war to give that sense of the sarcasm behind it, the sense that this war isn't really a war. And giving it a title, war, this war on terror, is more than it deserves. The stories repeat themselves. Same headlines, same geography, same mortality. So they're making the same mistakes over and over again. And again, we have that same use of repetition. We are losing interest and we fear it means nothing. Again, we have this phrase, we. She is talking about America. And in the same sense here that she was talking about how she was excited, the rest of the country was also having that same sense of energy behind the conflict that they were entering. And so when she's saying we're losing interest, there's this expectation that there would be this exciting conclusion to, or this triumph that would come about as a result of this conflict that they were entering. And again, this mention of fear, and this fear that they had gone through all of this war and this repetition of mortality for nothing, for no reason. It meant nothing. All of the loss. September 11 stands out now like a depot, the last train station before a vast, unknown prairie, where the engine of the events groaned and roared and hauled America back into the wilderness. So here we have the simile combined with the metaphor, and she's using that moment, September 11, as the moment of arrival, that America has been thrown back into that wild west that it was before everything was tamed. It was the beginning of lost days, of disastrous reaction, of fumbling around in the world. So she uses this description to make it sound like they don't know what they're doing. We had already tamed our own hostile landscapes, the enormous stretches of the West, stamped out what came before, emptied and erased a vast run of earth so that we, the Americans, could have a tabula rasa. Sorry, there's a word missing here. It's meant to be have. Could have a tabula rasa. Could invent a new nation and grow strong. So tabula rasa means blank slate. And the idea stems from the concept that they could delete everything that's gone before and build the world how they want it. And then September 11 came and infected us with the idea that we could tame all the wilderness of the world too and make ourselves perfectly safe. Now this stems from the idea of manifest destiny. And what manifest destiny means is the idea that America was destined to dominate their continent, the continent of North America, that they were destined to dominate it, that it was God's vision for what they had to do, and they were going to democratize and bring civilization to America. And so now with the impact of September 11, there's this idea that they now have this duty, this idea that they should tame the world. So like the wild west of America, they tamed it and brought it into a civilized society. They feel like they can do that, or it's their job to do that for the rest of the world. And in doing that, they would make themselves safe. I wanted to see, and so I went along to watch. This idea that her curiosity is what was driving her desire to be part of what was happening. And this idea that she was distant from it somehow, that she wasn't going to be involved in any of it. She was just an observer. And as we see, as we read on, she can't keep herself distant. She can't keep the impact of what happens away from her own life. I was younger than I realized and extremely American, sentimental but not stupid. I didn't go to Afghanistan with any strong convictions. I was a reporter and I wanted to see. Only after covering it for years did I understand that the war on terror never really existed. It was not a real thing. Not that the war on terror was flawed, not that it was cynical or self-defeating, or likely to breed more resentment and violence, but that it was hollow. It was essentially nothing but a unifying myth for a complicated scramble of mixed impulses and social theories and night terrors and cruelty and business interests, all overhung with the unassailable memory of falling skyscrapers. So the skyscrapers are a reference to September 11 and the bombing of the attack on the Twin Towers. And she's saying that the war on terror is not a real war. It's a collection. It's a myth that we tell ourselves. We use this word war on terror to clump a whole heap of different impulses and reactions that they are having to the world. And it comes from this desire to feel like they're doing something about what happened, and this fear, their own insecurity, now that they realize that they are not untouchable. And she also mentions here the business interests. She also mentions here the business interests and the corruption that comes about from those who profit from war. And so she's saying it's all a myth. It's not real. What we have done and what we think we did isn't what it was. It's not something that was bad. It's not something that the war isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily something that led to resentment. It just didn't exist. It wasn't a real war. It was just a series of campaigns. There were, of course, certain wars, certain campaigns, certain speeches. And so we have that repetition there of certain. Sorry about my handwriting off to the side here. We have that repetition of certain to suggest that this is that there were actual conflicts that happened. But if we're going to be honest, those conflicts were separate things. It wasn't a connected war. They were lumped under one heading, all nestled together under a heading. But this war we all talked about wasn't a coherent system or a philosophy or a strategy. Maybe it was a way for Americans to convince ourselves that we were still strong and correct. Mostly, I think, it was fear. Fear made more dangerous by gaping American estrangement from the rest of the world. Fear at a loss for an object. So she's saying that all of the conflicts that followed September 11 stemmed from their fear. And that fear came because they were so disconnected and so self-absorbed as a nation with America. They were so self-absorbed with themselves that they weren't connected to what was happening with the rest of the world. And they were afraid, but they didn't have an actual physical object that they were afraid of. It was this abstract fear of everything else outside of themselves. And so because they had no physical actual object that they could attack and eradicate, that fear stemmed into conflict after conflict with everything rather than something that could be resolved. A really fascinating idea that she's got there. As Americans, we have the gift of detaching ourselves and drifting on. And it has saved us over and over again from getting mired in guilt or stuck in the past. Sometimes we are too good at it. Here in the same generation, the wars happening over there, elsewhere, already have the irreality of a dream. So even though America is sending soldiers overseas, from back home in America, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like they're actually at war. It doesn't feel like they're involved in this conflict, that it's happening elsewhere, just like it was with her Uncle Johnny. It's the effect of time, too, and years piling up. You can't remember it all, and you can't explain why you did what you did. You have a few drinks and call an old friend and say, "This happened, remember? This happened, and we were there." But the wars are still happening, and they have been happening all along. So we have that repetition again of happened and happening. And so contrasting the idea that it was in the past when it's actually still in the present. People died, promises were broken, things were destroyed. And as Americans, these actions belong to us. We should remember those days, or we should admit they meant nothing. And if they meant nothing, then there is the question of how much we have lost and why. As it turned out, the first thing I knew about war was also the truest, and maybe it's as true for nations as for individuals. You can survive and not survive, both at the same time. And so we have that idea of war as being something personal, but also something universal. Okay, so hopefully that has helped you understand what she's talking about a bit more, and I'll see you again hopefully in the next video.